for lesson 4 of chapter 19, and yeah, we're still in chapter 19. So for lesson 4, we are looking at standard deviation. Standard deviation is just another way of measuring the data. Anyone who is analyzing data that was collected would want to know standard deviation because it tells them how spread out the data is. So let me give you one quick example. So follow me on this one for a minute. But if I took a list of data for the class and the average was an 80% for the last test, well, that's great to know that the average was 80, but you wouldn't know if that means that half the class scored a 75 and the other class scored an 85, because that would give you an average of 80, or if half the class scored a 60 and the other half scored 100, that would also give me an average of 80, but the first case is way less spread out than the second case. And so that's where standard deviation comes in, is it would tell somebody else who's looking at your data how spread out the data is. So if we had a big standard deviation, that means that the data would be more spread out than if we had a smaller one. So for this, there is a formula, and we have something like this in our formula packet. I know this looks ugly. It's really not as bad as you think. We're going to walk through it in steps so you can see what all these things represent and just how this would work if we were to use a formula in order to find standard deviation. So taking a look right here, for this we're going to come up with the mean of the data, and we're also going to come up with a standard deviation. So we're going to look at 3 examples, and then you'll be doing 3 examples to match these for the assignment that follows. So right here for example 1, this is our list of data that we're going to be working with. So I want you to take a look at the formula here for just a minute. Here's what this formula is asking us to do. X represents the data points. So these are the X values right here. X with the bar is the average, and we've already looked at that. The X with the bar is our mean. So simply what I'm going to do is I'm going to take each point, I'm going to subtract the mean, I'm going to square that number, I'm going to multiply it by the frequencies if we have a frequency list. The sigma is the sum. This is the sum of all that information. And then I'm going to divide it by the number of terms. And then I'm going to square root that. For some cases, you may not need all of those steps because, well, for an example like this, we don't have a frequency list. So that's not a part of this process that I'll need for this particular problem because there is no frequency list. So again, let me go through it in the steps. And that's why we do these with the charts. It just helps you break down the steps that we will be using for this formula. So the first thing that we have is the X's, and that's our list of our data. So that's the first column. So we have our list of the X values that you see up above. From each X value, I need to subtract the mean. So in order to do that, we first had to find the mean, and so that's what you're seeing right here. And we've already dealt with that in earlier lessons for how you find the mean. So it was 6.2. So I'm doing each value minus 6.2 in order to get this number. So I did 3 minus 6.2 to get this one. Then I did 7 minus 6.2 to get this one. I did 12 minus 6.2 to get this one. 5 minus 6.2 here, and 4 minus 6.2 here. You'll notice that I wrote all of these as positives. I know that some of those were negative, but I just sort of ignore the signs because in the next step, we're going to square those, and they're all going to become positive anyway. So I didn't really pay attention to the signs on that. I just dealt with the difference between those values. Anyway, so if you're following the formula, this is the next step in the process. We're going to square what we just did. So I took the 3.2 and I squared it, and that gave me 10.24. 0.8 squared is this, and then just keep on going down the list. I squared all of those terms. There's no frequency list, so we just jump to the next symbol, which is the sum. We find the sum of all of this. And so if I take this column and I add it all together, I get 50.8. So that's my sum. I then divide it by the number of terms. So I have my 50.8. I divide it by the number of terms. And then I square root that answer, and I have my standard deviation. There's a couple symbols. We'll get to calculator stuff later, but just be aware that when we get to the calculator, even though this is what we see in the formula, this is the symbol that we look for when we get to the calculator. There's a little difference between doing a population and doing a sample. On a test, you will always be asked for the population, not the sample. And so this is the formula that we always stick with. So this is the symbol right here, the little O, that we'll be dealing with when we get to the calculator stuff later. So moving on. Same idea right here, but in this case we now have a frequency list to deal with. So I'm using the exact same formula that we just did from the last page, but now we just have one extra step of using a frequency list. So first things first, the first step in the formula, let's see if I can get it all on the screen for you. So the first step in that formula, we start with the inner part of the parentheses, and I just make my list of x values. So right here is my list of x values. I had a 3, a 7, a 12, a 5, and a 4. Right next to that, I'm going to create the frequency list. So if you look right here, I had 2 3s. So that's why there's a 2 right there. I had 1 7, 2 12s, 3 5s, and 2 4s. So that is my frequency list. The main thing for what you're seeing in the next part of this is just to help me find the average, or to find the mean. Remember, to find the mean, we do the sum of all of our data divided by the number of terms. And so to get the sum of all of my data, I'm going to do 3 times 2, 7 times 1, 12 times 2. I'm going to go on down the list, and then I add all that together, and that gives me the sum of all of my data. I then divide it by the number of terms. We had 10 terms, and there's our mean. So we have the mean of 6. And if I just pay attention to the column headings, I just keep going on down the list. The next part of the formula that we did in the last problem was to do each x value minus the mean. So these are my x values. From each of those, I'm going to subtract 6. So I'm going to do 3 minus 6 to get this one, 7 minus 6 to get this one, 12 minus 6, 5 minus 6, and 4 minus 6. The next item in the formula is to square those terms. So 3 squared is 9. And then just go on down the list. I squared all of my terms. And then again, after you square them, you multiply them times their frequencies. So right here, after I squared it and got 9, I now do 9 times 2 to give me 18. So if you see, this is the symbol of what I'm doing. I squared those numbers, and now I multiply them by the f, or the frequency column. So that's where I got the 18. So I did 1 times 1 to get 1. I did 36 times 2 to get 72, so on and so on. The next part of the formula is to find the sum of everything that we just did. So I now add all those numbers up and get their sum of 102. So here, all of this is the sum of 102. I divide by the number of terms, which is 10. Last, I take the square root, and I got 3.19, which is the population standard deviation. So that's how we do it with a frequency list. And then there's one last case right here. And this is how we do it with classes. So this is the third case. I'm using the same formula. This is the same formula we've been working with all along, but it's now working with a list of classes instead of specific x values. So, got to keep in mind what we did in an earlier lesson. Whenever I had a list of classes, instead of specific x values, what did we use for the x's? We used the mid-intervals as our x values. So if I have a class from 4 to 8, the mid-interval of that class would be 6. Remember, it's just like finding an average. 4 plus 8 divided by 2 is 6. And so the mid-interval is 6. The mid-interval for this class is 11. The mid-interval here is 16. So this is my list of data. These are my x values. from here, it's going to be the exact same thing as what I just did in example 2. So I'm going to start by finding my mean. So the same way you would always find the mean, I do each term times its frequency, and I add all those together to get the sum of all of my data. So that 210 is the sum of all of my data. I divide it by the number of terms, which is this column right here, the frequencies. If I add all those up, that's the number of terms. And there's my average or my mean of 10.5. And from there, we're just going to go down with the same formula that we've been using all along. You take each term minus the mean, so minus 10.5, and that gives you this column right here. Once you get these guys, you square them to get these numbers. Once you're here, you multiply these times the F, or the frequency column, to get this column here. You then add all this up to get the sum. Remember, that's your sum of all of your data, so 195. So here we are, we got the sum of our data, 195, divided by the number of terms, which is 20. Last, we take the square root, and there's our standard deviation. So, and again, we just use the table that you see here just to help walk us through the use of this big old formula that we're working with on this one right here. So 3 sig figs as always. So I left my answer to 3 sig figs. Within the problem itself, I should be going deeper. So I did more than 3 sig figs within the problem, but I went with 3 sig figs at the very end for my finished product. So for homework, to go with this, what the class is going to be doing are these 3 problems here. You're going to do problem number 1 exactly like example 1. This is the answer, so that you know if you do it right. So set up the table and the chart just like we did it for example 1, but use these numbers. You're going to model this one just like we did for example 2. So set up a table just like I did in example 2 and walk through those steps. This will be the answer for number 2 if you do it right. And then number 3, we're going to use this table right here for number 3. Model this just like the one I did up above for example 3. In fact, you can just continue building your table right here. You just attach it right onto what I've already started, and you can do this for problem number 3 and model it just like example 3. This will be the answer if you do it right.